All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. I think it's fair to say that for a lot of folks who are, drawn to philosophy, there's kind of this recurring thing, this fascination with these big, core questions. What makes us human? What does it even mean to be human? What does a just society look like? How are we supposed to live together? And today we're going to kind of grapple with these questions, but through a really unique lens, through the thought of Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, Frederick Douglass is a name you hear a lot, but thinking about him as someone who's, really shaped American political philosophy, that's pretty profound when you think about his journey, right? From literally being enslaved to becoming this powerful leading voice in the abolitionist movement, it's a life that gives you, I think, this almost unparalleled perspective on those fundamental principles we're talking about, justice, freedom, what it means to be human.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want to really dive deep into his thinking,
right?
His autobiographies are the place to start. There's the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. There's My Bondage and My Freedom and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And these aren't just personal stories, right? They're these really incisive critiques of society as it was, powerful moral arguments.
Totally. And that's what makes Douglass so fascinating, right? It's not just the personal story. It's that he was able to connect that lived experience to this really profound moral reasoning. He was grappling with ideas like humanity, liberty, equality, property, democracy, all those big ones. But for him, it wasn't theoretical, right? It was grounded in the reality of slavery. And I think he gets to the ethical, even theological, the core of these concepts. It's not surprising that his work is still so relevant today. You see it in American philosophy, Africana philosophy, Black political philosophy. Really, across the board in social and political thought, his influence is huge.
So, we're not just doing a biographical sketch here, right? What we want to do is really unpack Douglass's philosophical contributions. And we're going to focus on the key themes that help us understand him from a philosophical perspective. So we'll be digging into his analysis of slavery, how he saw it as the philosophical problem. We'll look at his ideas about natural law, his arguments for liberty, those are powerful. And then how he grappled with the U.S. Constitution, it's complicated. His perspective on violence and self-respect, and his vision of universal human brotherhood, that's a big one. His thoughts on assimilation and integration, those are nuanced. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at his understanding of leadership. So let's get started. And maybe the best place to begin is by really understanding how Douglass understood slavery itself, not just as, a historical fact, but as a problem. A philosophical problem.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head there. For Douglass, slavery wasn't just some kind of social or economic system, a thing that happened. It was an attack, a fundamental attack on what it means to be a person. He actually defined it as, and this is a quote, the granting of that power by which one man exercises and enforces a right of property in the body and soul of another. Think about the weight of that, right? The philosophical weight. It's reducing another human being to an object, a brute beast, a marketable commodity, just the thing to be bought and sold. That denial of someone's basic humanity, that was at the core of his whole critique.
And his condemnation was, it wasn't like he wavered on this. He saw slavery as cruel, obviously, but unnatural, ungodly, immoral, unjust, all of it, And it's striking how he comes back to these moral arguments over and over again throughout his life and everything he wrote. It's clearly a core principle for him.
Absolutely. And what I find so insightful is how he went head to head with the mainstream racist ideologies of his time, right? The belief that Black people were somehow inferior, that was everywhere. But Douglass, he didn't shy away from that. He asserted the humanity of Black people, their rationality, their full range of emotions. Think about his "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech.
Yeah.
He has these powerful rhetorical questions, but the very fact that he even had to argue for Black humanity, that was the most damning indictment of his time.
It's he flipped the script. He was saying it's slavery that degrades people, not just the enslaved people, but also the enslavers. And he pointed out the hypocrisy, right? The slaveholders who were claiming to be Christians, but then denying those very Christian principles to the people they were enslaving. It laid bare the lies at the heart of the system.
And to connect that to broader philosophical ideas, Douglass saw slavery as this massive violation of natural rights, the inherent rights, that belong to all people simply because they are human. He saw it as a contradiction of God's law, as he understood it. It clashed with American ideals, and it was a roadblock to moral and social progress. For him, slavery just went against everything that made us human, everything that a just society should be built on.
So, this idea of natural law is fundamental to his whole argument against slavery, right?
Yeah.
So I think we need to unpack that a bit. How did Douglas understand natural law? What was it for him? And how did that shape his critique of slavery?
Well, for Douglas, natural law wasn't just some abstract idea, right? It wasn't just theory. It was something he saw being revealed in human progress. Like, think about his 1853 speech, The Present Condition and Future Prospects of the Negro People. He talks about advancements in technology, railroads, communication. And he argues that these are the things that are going to undermine slavery because they're connecting people, breaking down the isolation that slavery depends on. He saw history itself as pushing back against this injustice.
So where did this belief come from? Where did he get this conviction in natural law?
I think it was a mix of influences. The U.S. founding documents, the Enlightenment thinkers, those were definitely important. And then, his work in the abolitionist movement, he was exposed to a lot of thinkers who believed in natural rights. And, he was also coming out of this period of religious revival, the Second Great Awakening. There was this emphasis on individual conscience, on social reform. And I think all of these threads come together in his understanding of a moral order, a divine moral order, but one that we can understand through reason and that shows up in the progress of society.
But it wasn't passive, right? It's not like he thought, oh, well, natural law exists, so slavery will just disappear on its own.
No, not at all. He had this idea, this really interesting idea of enacted providence. He did believe in divine justice, but he also knew that humans had to act to make that justice happen in the real world. So agitation, protest, even military action if necessary, those are the ways that humans could, align themselves with natural law and bring about the end of slavery. He wasn't just waiting for God to do it, he was calling for action. You see that in his 1852 4th of July speech, that powerful speech where he talks about God's justice working through the actions of oppressed people.
But, there's this point about Douglas's view of progress that's worth considering. What did that mean for how he viewed non-European societies? It's a question worth asking.
Yeah, that's an important critique. I mean, he had this, narrative of historical progress and civilization, and sometimes it did kind of echo some of those 19th century ideas about non-Western societies being somehow less advanced. That's definitely something we need to look at critically, through a modern lens. And
Right.
and the fact that he didn't really say much about the U.S. was treating Native Americans, that's a significant gap. It suggests that maybe his vision of progress wasn't as universal as he thought it was.
Okay, so let's move on to another big part of his philosophy. Liberty and rights. I mean, he was clearly a huge advocate for these things. But how did he actually articulate them from a philosophical standpoint?
So Douglas, he really championed those core liberal ideals, individual liberty, the equality of all people, the right to be your own person, the right to own property, the right to defend yourself, freedom of speech, the dignity of labor, democracy, and this idea he had of composite nationality, which is this vision of a multi-ethnic, multiracial society where everyone belongs. And all of these ideas are woven together in his work. But I think his arguments for free speech, for property rights, and this idea of composite nationality, those are really philosophically rich.
Well, let's start with free speech then. I mean, given his own life, it must have been incredibly important to him.
It was. I mean, his whole life after escaping slavery shows how much value he placed on being able to think for yourself and speak your mind. From teaching himself to read to founding his own newspaper, the North Star, he understood that real freedom means being able to express yourself without fear. And his plea for freedom of speech in Boston that he gave in 1860, that's a classic defense of free speech.
Mm-hmm.
He says, and I'm quoting here, that no one should be overawed by force and compelled to suppress his honest sentiments.
And his argument went further than just the speaker, right? He was thinking about the listeners, too.
Exactly. Like John Stuart Mill, Douglas saw that suppressing speech actually harms two parties. You're wronging the speaker, obviously, but you're also wronging the people who would have listened, who could have learned something, maybe even changed their minds. When you silence one voice, you're actually stopping the free flow of ideas, and that's essential for a healthy society.
Okay, what about his arguments for property rights? Because it's clear that he's against the ownership of human beings, obviously.
Yeah.
But were there deeper philosophical principles there?
Yes, definitely. So while he absolutely condemned the idea of owning people, he was also a big supporter of the right to own property, especially for formerly enslaved people. He saw it as a core part of being free, having control over your own body, the things you produce through your labor, being able to accumulate wealth and manage it yourself. And, I mean, his own experience with Hugh Alt stealing his wages, that's a powerful example of this violation. He writes about it in his narrative, and he compares it to being robbed by a pirate. That's how unjust he saw it. It shows how deeply he believed that everyone deserves the right to the fruits of their labor.
That's powerful. It's like the personal experience really drives home the philosophical principle.
For sure. And throughout his life, even after emancipation, Douglass always emphasized that for Black Americans to be truly free, they needed to have economic agency. They needed the right to work, to own property, to build their own lives. It wasn't just about legal freedom, it was about economic freedom, too.
Okay, so then there's this concept of composite nationality. I mean, for his time, that was a really progressive idea. What's the philosophy behind that?
So in 1869, he wrote this essay called Our Composite Nationality, and he basically laid out a vision of America as this multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy where belonging isn't tied to your race or your ethnicity. And he talks about assimilation, like adopting shared cultural norms, and amalgamation, which is the actual mixing of races. And he saw both of these things as like the natural path towards a stronger, more unified, and truly inclusive nation. It was radical for the time.
So it sounds like his thinking drew from both, like liberal and civic Republican traditions.
Yeah, that's a good observation. So his emphasis on individual rights, that's very much in line with liberal thought. But then he also really valued civic engagement, democratic reform, working towards the common good. And that puts him in the civic Republican camp. I mean, his autobiographies, especially My Bondage and My Freedom, they really show this through stories of solidarity, cooperation, collective action within the enslaved community. But ultimately, it's not just about fitting him into a neat category. It's about understanding that these values formed the bedrock of his opposition to slavery and how he interpreted the U.S. Constitution. And speaking of the Constitution, that's a really interesting part of his story.
Yeah, I mean, his changing views on the Constitution are fascinating. He famously went from seeing it as a pro-slavery document to an anti-slavery document. It's quite a shift, so let's unpack that a bit.
Yeah, it is a big shift. So early on, he was influenced by William Lloyd Garrison, and he saw the Constitution as basically pro-slavery, that the people who wrote it had deliberately protected slavery in the South. And there were even some who thought the free states should just secede, completely separate themselves from this morally corrupt document. But then around 1851, Douglass had this big change of heart. He said he was tired of arguing on the slaveholder's side, and he started to align himself with people like Gerrit Smith in the Liberty Party, who argued that the Constitution, if you interpret it correctly, through the lens of natural law, is actually anti-slavery. And they pointed out that even the founders themselves were divided on the issue of slavery.
So what caused this change? What made him rethink his whole position?
Well, a few things. For one, he was looking for a more active strategy for abolishing slavery, something that wasn't just accepting the threat of secession from the slave states. And he became more and more convinced by this idea of the natural law reading of the Constitution. Basically, that the Declaration of Independence, with its emphasis on natural rights, that was the real heart of the nation's founding principles. And those principles, he believed, were fundamentally against slavery. And then the arguments made by Gerrit Smith and Lysander Spooner, they really resonated with him. They were saying that the Constitution, when you read it through the lens of natural rights, is an anti-slavery document.
So that's how he gets to that famous 1852 speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" He's basically laying out this new interpretation, right?
Exactly. He argues that slavery isn't just morally wrong, it also violates the principles of the Constitution itself. This new understanding allowed him to argue for resistance against slavery, even if it meant violence, but within the framework of American ideals. He wasn't rejecting America. He was saying that America needed to live up to its own principles. He saw the Constitution as a living document, something that should be interpreted in light of human progress and the realization of those core ideals.
It's amazing how he used the very document that was often used to justify slavery as a tool for dismantling it. But, there's a critique here, right? That maybe this interpretation kind of overlooked how deep racial prejudice was in America. Like, it wasn't just a matter of legal interpretation. There was a whole social and cultural context.
Yeah, that's an important point. And some scholars do argue that Douglass's focus on these universal principles might have sometimes overshadowed the very real ways that racism shaped how those principles were actually applied. Like it wasn't a level playing field. But it's also important to remember that Douglass never stopped calling out America's hypocrisy, its failure to live up to its ideals on race and justice. His reinterpretation of the Constitution was a powerful tool in the fight against slavery, but it wasn't the whole story.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about something that's both personal and philosophically important in Douglass's life. Violence and self-respect. His fight with Covey, that's a key moment in his autobiographies. What's the deeper philosophical meaning there?
Yeah, so Douglas rejected pacifism later in his life, and he actually supported military action to end slavery. But I think the seeds of that are in that fight with Covey, the slave breaker. It's more than just a story, it's a turning point. It's him asserting his manhood, his dignity, his right to be free, even in the face of this brutal, dehumanizing oppression.
And the way he writes about it in the narrative and my bondage and my freedom, it is different, isn't it?
It is. So in the narrative, it's about him rekindling his spirit of resistance. But in My Bondage and My Freedom, he frames it more philosophically. It's connected to the larger struggle against slavery, and it has these political implications. It's about how individual action can contribute to collective liberation.
And philosophers have had a lot to say about that fight, right? I mean, it's become this kind of symbol.
Yeah, for sure. People have analyzed it through different lenses, like the idea of the state of war in liberal theory, or the dynamics of respect and recognition between people. Bernard Boxill, he's a philosopher. He has this interesting interpretation. He says that the fight is an example of self-respect. The idea that you have inherent moral worth and you demand that other people recognize that. It's like saying, I'm a human being and I deserve to be treated as such.
And then there's that famous quote from Douglas, "A man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity." It's a pretty provocative statement. What do you think he means by that?
Yeah, it is provocative. And I think what he's getting at is that while dignity is something we all have inherently, sometimes you have to fight for it, You have to defend it against those who would deny it. He's not saying that people who can't or won't fight back are less worthy, but he's saying that in a system like slavery, where violence is the norm, the ability to resist, to fight back, that becomes essential for preserving your sense of self, your dignity. He thought that it's hard for people to truly respect someone who they see as completely powerless and passive. So for him, dignity is both something you have inherently and something you have to actively protect.
But, some people might say that this emphasis on physical force, it's kind of a masculine perspective, that it doesn't account for other forms of resistance, especially those used by women who often couldn't physically fight back in the same way.
That's a fair critique. I mean, the language of manhood and the focus on this physical confrontation, it does raise questions about whose experiences are being centered. And while Douglas didn't think that only those who fought back physically had dignity, the fact that this fight is so central to his story, it does make you think about how we understand different forms of resistance, especially those that weren't as visible or dramatic.
Okay, let's move on to a more unifying theme in Douglas's thought: universal human brotherhood. What was the philosophy behind this belief for him?
So Douglas had this idea of providence, right? This blend of American individualism, activism, and divine intervention. And combined with his belief in natural law, that led him to this vision of universal human brotherhood. And he saw that as compatible with both American ideals and Christian ethics. It was really important to him, especially as a counter to those racist theories that were popping up, like polygenesis, which was this bogus idea that different races came from different origins and were naturally unequal.
So he used this idea of shared humanity to fight back against those racist theories.
Absolutely. He was adamant that Black people were not subhuman or inferior in any way. And he drew a lot from Christian theology, emphasizing that all humans are God's children, equal in his eyes, regardless of their race or social status. And he often quoted Robert Burns, "A man's a man for a' that." That sums up his belief in the fundamental equality of all people.
And he specifically used the Bible to back up this argument.
Yeah, he did. He pointed out that the whole authority of the Bible rests on the idea that humanity is one family. He often quoted Acts 17.26, which says that God made of one blood all nations of men. For him, and for a lot of abolitionists, this wasn't just religious dogma, it was a profound truth about human dignity, and it meant that everyone deserved equal rights and equal freedom.
Okay, let's talk about his ideas on assimilation, amalgamation, and integration. He had some really interesting and, again, progressive views on this. Can you break down the philosophy there?
So because he believed so strongly in universal human brotherhood, and because he saw racial mixing already happening in America, he supported amalgamation, which is the biological mixing of races. He saw it as a positive sign, like it was breaking down racial barriers. And, it's important to note that he did believe in the existence of different biological races, but he didn't think that meant people were unequal. He envisioned a future where those differences would gradually fade away and create this new unified American people. And his own marriage to Helen Pitts, a white woman, that was a very public expression of this belief.
And he was careful to distinguish between amalgamation and assimilation, right?
Right. So amalgamation is about biology, the actual mixing of races. Assimilation is about culture, adopting shared norms and values, and Douglas was a proponent of both. In Our Composite Nationality, he argues that everyone in America, regardless of their origin, should be molded into a shared American identity. He talks about common laws, a common language, a common government, a shared commitment to liberty. But for him, assimilation wasn't about erasing all cultural differences. It was about sharing a common civic culture.
And what about his stance on integration versus separatist movements? Like, some people thought black people should emigrate, create their own separate societies. What did Douglas think about that?
He was completely against it. He thought Black Americans had earned their place in America, through centuries of labor. Their history was tied to American soil. He criticized segregated institutions, and he really went after those who were advocating for Black immigration to Africa or other places. He saw it as giving up on the fight for equality, denying their rightful place as American citizens. But towards the end of his life, when things were getting really bad with Jim Crow, he did start to understand why some people chose to leave, even though he still believed in integration as the ultimate goal.
So Douglas was obviously a leader himself. How did he think about leadership as a concept, philosophically?
Well, his own journey was really important here. He went from being someone whose voice was mostly amplified by white abolitionists to being this independent, powerful leader. And that shaped his understanding of leadership. He believed in people speaking for themselves, sharing their own experiences, fighting for their communities. And his legacy was interpreted in different ways by later Black leaders, especially W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. They had different ideas about how to achieve equality.
So how did those later leaders see him? How did they use his example?
Du Bois often portrayed Douglas as this radical figure, someone who wanted immediate and complete equality and integration. And he contrasted that with Booker T. Washington, who had a more gradual, accommodationist approach. But Du Bois also disagreed with Douglas on the issue of racial amalgamation. He thought it was important to preserve a distinct Black identity and culture, and that's a big part of his idea of double consciousness. So they had different visions for how Black people could advance, but they both believed in some kind of assimilation into American society. Washington, on the other hand, he kind of downplayed Douglas's radicalism, his demands for immediate equality. But it's important to remember that Douglas himself was often more collaborative than either of those interpretations suggest. He believed in collective action, grassroots organizing, and he really admired people like John Brown and Abraham Lincoln, people who he saw as embodying principled leadership.
Okay, let's talk about his views on women's suffrage. He was a supporter, but it was complicated, right? There were some tensions there.
Yeah, so Douglas was definitely for women's suffrage. He worked with the American Equal Rights Association, which was trying to get voting rights for both Black people and women. But things got tricky after the Civil War with the push for the 15th Amendment. That amendment gave Black men the right to vote, but not women.
And that's when things started to fracture within the movement.
Exactly. Some of the leaders in the women's suffrage movement, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they were against the 15th Amendment because it didn't include women. And sadly, some of them even used racist arguments, saying that white women were more deserving of the vote than Black men. And Douglas really called them out on that, especially Stanton. He was furious.
So he felt like Black male suffrage was more urgent at that moment?
Yeah, he did. He saw it as a matter of life and death for Black men in the South who were facing so much violence and oppression. He always said he supported women's right to vote, but he felt that the immediate threat to Black men's lives meant their enfranchisement had to come first. He said that when women faced the same level of violence and oppression that Black people did, then their cause would be just as urgent. But, looking back, it is clear that he didn't always fully grasp the specific ways that being denied the vote impacted Black women and how their needs might be different.
Okay, so finally, let's talk about Douglas's thoughts on the rise of Jim Crow. I mean, slavery was over, but the fight for equality was far from over. He must have been incredibly disappointed by how things turned out.
He was. In the years after Reconstruction, he saw how Black civil rights were being eroded, how racial terrorism was on the rise, and how systems like peonage were basically re-enslaving people. And while he hadn't been in favor of large-scale Black migration before, he started to understand why people were fleeing the South. He became a vocal critic of the justice system, the convict lease system, the whole thing. And he worked with Ida B. Wells Barnett to fight against lynching.
He was really blunt about how emancipation had failed to deliver on its promises, wasn't he?
Yeah, he famously called it a stupendous fraud, and you can hear the bitterness in his voice. He was disillusioned, He'd fought so hard, and yet things were still so bad. The Stanford entry ends its discussion of Douglass with that powerful image from his narrative, the one where he looks out at the ships sailing to freedom in Chesapeake Bay. And I think that image sums up his lifelong longing for liberation and the tragedy that even after emancipation, that liberation was still so far out of reach for so many.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's just take a minute to recap Douglass's key contributions to philosophy.
We talked about his arguments against slavery, based on natural law and human dignity, his broad vision of liberty and equality, his interpretation of the Constitution as an anti-slavery document, even though that was a controversial view, his idea that self-respect is both a right and something you have to defend, his belief in the fundamental unity of all humanity, which was so important in fighting racism, and his complex but ultimately pro-integration views on assimilation and amalgamation.
And it's clear that the questions he was grappling with, they're still relevant today. We're still having these debates about race, justice, equality, what it means to be free. David Blight called him the prophet of freedom, and I think that's spot on. His work is still speaking to us.
Absolutely. And I think one quote really captures his vision for America. It's from his 1869 On Composite Nationalities speech. He says he wants an America where everyone, regardless of their background, is united by the same laws, the same language, the same government, the same commitment to liberty, and the same national goals. It's a powerful vision, and we're still working towards it,
It's a vision that challenges us even today. And it leaves us with a question, something to think about. How far have we come towards realizing that vision? And what work still needs to be done? We encourage you to read Douglass, to learn from him, to be inspired by him. He has so much to teach us about the ongoing fight for justice and equality. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.